I'm Alexandra Henn, and this podcast was produced as part of the Premodern World's podcast project at Georgetown University. A wooden sculpture stands about 4 feet high, strikingly depicting a mother holding her child. The mother sits in a proud seated position, with an elongated torso and body parts that are curved and exaggerated. Her belly is round and protruding, as if she is still pregnant, and her baby sits atop of it, latched onto her torso. This sculpture originated from the Bamana peoples of West Africa sometime during the late 17th to early 18th century, in what is now Mali. It was displayed in the Sahel Art and Empires on the Shores of the Sahara exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City in 2020. The Bamana peoples were part of a group of states including Ségou, with a rural, hunting-based society. Their people participated in many forms of art, such as pottery, weaving, and sculpture. Sculptures, masks, and other art pieces were important in the ritualistic customs of the Bamana peoples. Bamana religion was based around various initiation associations, called the Jo, which taught initiates about the morals and values of life. Moving through the 6 societies of initiation, young people in Bamana society learned life lessons that marked their rite of passage into adulthood. These initiation associations formed a foundation of tradition and became important in the process of sharing societal knowledge across generations. One of the initiation associations that Bamana members must pass through is the Jo Society, for which training begins during childhood. After 6 years of training, the adolescents are initiated by being symbolically killed and revived, returning a week later as full members of Jo Society. Jo initiation was mandatory for young males in Bamana society, although some women were eligible to be inducted as well. Upon the return of the initiates, the Bamana peoples held a large Jo celebration filled with art, music, performance, and rituals. Blacksmiths, an important group in society, performed at the celebration with their sculptures, which were often made of wood. With this, art was a very important part of the religious and cultural identity of the Bamana people. Within it lies the foundational values that make up their society. In her essay, A Human Ideal in African Art, Bamana Figurative Sculpture, Mary Arnaldi writes,
Bamana art is something that attracts your attention, focuses your eye, and directs your thoughts. Bamana ideals of constraint, balance, discernment, and control, which characterize appropriate action in society, find their material expression in this sculptural oeuvre.
This particular sculpture of mother and child was part of a group of pieces displayed at the annual celebration of Jo Society, where the art pieces were used in rituals. It was believed that sacrifices were required to restore the sculpture's power. In such rituals, the sculpture would be removed from its usual residence and washed with oil. Once the pieces glistened, it was adorned with cloth and beads to make it look more festive. The sculpture of the mother and child is associated with that of the Guan, an institution related to Jo that aids women with fertility, conception, childbearing, and maternity. This sculpture was displayed at the center of the group of sculptures, representing power and strength. The mother's headpiece, adorned with an amulet, is a symbol of her power. She also has a knife strapped to her arm, further emphasizing her power and wisdom. These symbols were typically associated with male hunters, but presented with the image of the mother, as they are in this sculpture, they illustrate the mother's position of responsibility, strength, and power in society. It was typical of the Bamana people to use art to portray their ideal standards of beauty and character. This specific sculpture, however, was referred to as Gwandansu, for its depiction of a regal, ideal mother figure and affiliation with fertility. A legendary figure, she took on important spiritual significance in society. Power and responsibility, as exhibited by the Gwandansu figure, were highly valued in Jo society. While men controlled the family affairs, hunting, and crafting, women were responsible for the essential work of agriculture, which enabled them to feed their communities, as well as domestic affairs. As common in past societies, Bamana women's primary role concerned that of motherhood. Mothers, such as the one in the art piece, had to be committed to both their familial and societal roles. The mother-child-like dynamic was one of cooperation, respect, and solidarity. In societies like that of Bamana, the bond of Bedenia, or mother-childness, was strong. Women and their children, and in turn children of the same mother, shared strong alliances of solidarity and affection. When looking at the sculpture, one notices the mother's arms lay resting on the shoulders of her baby, giving a display of protection and affection. With this, it's easy to see how such a striking art piece could have represented such maternal and feminine power. This concept of Bedenia, the strong bond between mother and child in polygamous societies, can be seen in the Epic of Sanjara, a West African epic that tells of Mali's legendary founder. In the epic, Sanjara's mother exhibits extreme loyalty and solidarity with her son, and in his childhood, her prayers led him to overcoming his lameness. It is written,
"For Sanjara I have made this staff, if he be the man for the morrow. When this staff I give to Nare Magan Kanate, let Magan Kanate arise."
With this, readers can see the strong dedication Sanjara's mother has with him, and the tradition of mother-child solidarity lives on through the literature. This Bamana sculpture of mother and child is incredibly striking, and the symmetry and smoothness of the figures themselves suggest that great skill was required in creating the piece. The Bamana people were skilled craftsmen, particularly in iron and woodwork. Blacksmiths were very important in society, and they played a large role in mastering niyama, the energy of life. Blacksmiths harnessed their niyama into their work, as they often created masks and sculptures that were to be used in ritual. Sculptures were washed with oil until they had a dark, lustrous shine that was believed to represent niyama. These sculptures were often made of metal or wood. The use of wood to create these sculptures presents an interesting challenge to us in the modern day when it comes to studying these art pieces. Wood makes for beautiful sculptures, however it has a level of impermanence to it that is not seen in metalwork. The material of these sculptures can wither, and as wood is a porous material, it can be prone to blooms and other damage. A study in 1986 examined blooms found on sculptures from Mali and Bamana. In examining its contents, the study found that shea butter, along with other oils and waxes native to the region, were applied to the sculptures, probably in rituals such as that of the Jo celebration. Although the Bamana mother and child sculpture was not affected by blooms, it is interesting to explore the challenges conservators sometimes face when preserving works like these. Luckily, with modern science, we can study these wooden art pieces to gather information about when they were made, what they were used for, and what other materials they have come into contact with, despite the impermanent nature of the wood itself. As you may recall, the sculpture was estimated to be created between the 17th and 18th centuries, although it could have been made as late as the 19th century. This broad sweep of time is a result of some of the difficulties that come from dating and classifying African art, especially wooden pieces such as the mother and child sculpture. Today, carbon-14 testing is used to gain information on the age of wood used to make sculptures. However, this process provides exactly that, data on how old the wood is, but not on when the sculpture itself was made. Furthermore, using terms like pre-colonial, medieval, or pre-modern to categorize the mother and child sculpture proves to frame the piece in a Eurocentric light, detracting from its own robust cultural and historical context. With this, the study of sculptures like the Bamana mother and child sparks an important and extensive conversation about the terminology, dating, and study of African art. African history and African art can often be placed into timeless, homogeneous contexts, which inevitably detract from the richness and complexity that these cultures, both past and present, have. To further my research on this sculpture, and to gain insight on the use of terminology when studying African art, I had the opportunity to talk with Dr. Elisa Lagama, the Seal and Michael E. Pulitzer Curator in charge of the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas Department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. I spoke with Dr. Lagama about her work curating the Sahel exhibit, in which the sculpture was displayed, and about her thoughts on the use of the terms pre-colonial or medieval when describing African art.
Although great works of African art have relevance beyond the moment of their creation, it's incredibly important that we understand the specific contexts in which they were commissioned and to give them a complex historical reading, just like any other artistic tradition. I try to steer away from general terms like pre-colonial African art or medieval African art, because those kinds of terms frame the material in ways that are somewhat loaded. When we talk about the Middle Ages and medieval culture, we can't help ourselves from thinking about Europe. It doesn't do the work necessarily justice to define it in terms of a relatively Eurocentric chronology.
This conversation must be ongoing as we as a society continue to study African art in the coming years. It's important to give each piece its own complex historical and cultural context, and we must remember to be critical of the terms we use to describe each piece, being mindful of the detraction from the art's original context that we can impose on it. In this way, the sculpture of the mother and child represents a striking celebration of both the skill and significance of the Bamana peoples' art, as well as the strength and solidarity present in the mother-child dynamic of this culture. The sculpture also points to a long history of tradition and culturally significant ritualistic practices, as experienced by societies like Bamana. The traditions represented by this sculpture were alive even through the mid-20th century, as the Bamana people continued to practice Joe initiations into the arrival of Islam in West Africa. With this, the art of the Bamana people can provide us with a direct connection to past generations, and it can introduce us to a rich culture that we would not have been otherwise able to explore. Lastly, studying pieces like these can open our eyes to a new awareness about the ways we can end up distorting the context of African art by using terminology and classifications that detract from the piece's own original heritage. With this, it's important that we take greater care in giving African artworks, such as the Bamana Mother and Child, a rightfully complex historical reading that honors the piece's original context and allows us to appreciate the rich culture that it represents.